They won't say it out loud. They'll smile, they'll laugh with you, maybe even praise you in public. But behind closed doors, behind their polite tones and subtle sarcasm, there's a discomfort they can't hide. Not because you were cruel, not because you took anything from them, but because you dared to exist without their permission. You walked into the room without shrinking. You carried pain without bitterness. You stood when it would have been easier to kneel. And that is what disturbed them. Your strength was a mirror they weren't ready to look into, because it showed them everything they gave up on, everything they feared, everything they could never become. You didn't ask for attention, you didn't fight for approval, but somehow your very presence challenged the roles they played, the masks they wore, the lies they lived, and that's why they whispered. That's why they questioned your motives. That's why they kept trying to dim what they couldn't destroy. Not because you were wrong, but because you were too real. You refused to bow, so they labeled you arrogant. They didn't hate you because you shouted. They hated you because you didn't whisper. They didn't despise you because you fought back. No, they despised you because you didn't need to. You stood there, quiet, grounded, unshaken, and that was the problem. The world they come from teaches obedience dressed up as politeness, submission wrapped in humility, and silence mistaken for peace. You refused all of it. You didn't raise your voice to dominate, but you didn't lower your gaze to please either. And in their fragile understanding of confidence, they couldn't distinguish strength from rebellion or self-respect from arrogance. So they called you difficult, cold, unapproachable, because you didn't flatter their egos or bend your truth to make them comfortable. You carried yourself with the kind of poise that doesn't ask for permission to exist. And to the insecure, that is threatening, they expected you to shrink yourself to fit their narrative, to stay small so they could feel big. They tested you with silence, with passive aggression, with carefully planted doubt. They waited for you to break, but you didn't. You didn't chase after validation. You didn't beg for acceptance. You didn't entertain the emotional games they've mastered for years. And that's when they knew they couldn't control you. And what they can't control, they condemn. That's the pattern. You refused to be their echo, and that terrified them. Because if you wouldn't echo them, then you must be trying to outshine them. And the idea of someone shining without their approval, unbearable. But you weren't seeking to outshine anyone. You just refused to dim. You just existed in your truth, steadfast, grounded, and whole. You weren't perfect, no. You had doubts, you had fears, you had wounds stitched together by silence. But still you walked forward. Sometimes trembling, but always walking. You didn't pretend to be fearless. You simply chose not to be ruled by fear. And that decision, to keep walking without theatrics, without noise, without applause, confused them, because they were taught that strength must always be loud. They didn't understand the kind that whispers, the kind that's built in solitude, sharpened by heartbreak, and sealed in silence. They mistook your boundaries for attitude, your standards for pride, your distance for arrogance. But the truth is, they never hated your personality. They hated your resistance, your refusal to be manipulated, your quiet refusal to play small, your ability to sit in a room full of judgments and not explain yourself. That unnerved them because they needed you to play the role, to be the fragile one, the uncertain one, the one always questioning their worth. But you outgrew that, you evolved, and they were not ready for that evolution. So they gave you labels. They wrapped their discomfort in words like too proud, too much, too intense. Not because you were any of those things, but because your presence reminded them of what they gave up on in themselves. You didn't try to prove anything. You just stopped apologizing for being whole. And in a world that profits off insecurity, that kind of self-possession is revolutionary. That's why they resented you. Not because you did something wrong, but because you did something rare. You kept your soul intact while walking through storms they never survived. You stayed upright in a world that rewards bending. And even though they may never say it out loud, you were the truth that made their lies tremble. You chose healing over begging. There came a moment, quiet, unannounced, when you finally understood. Not everyone who breaks you deserves to watch you heal. You stopped explaining yourself to people who never really listened. You stopped opening wounds in front of those who only came to watch you bleed. And in that stillness, in that lonely but sacred silence, you chose something radical. You chose healing, not revenge, not chasing, not screaming to be understood, just healing. And that, more than anything, shook them, because they had grown used to your pain, your neediness, your dependence on their validation. They were comfortable with the version of you that reached out, that apologized first, that begged for crumbs of affection. But when you let go, not with anger, but with peace, they didn't know what to do with the quiet strength that followed. They expected you to come back, like always, to send the long message, to make the phone call, to second. Guess your boundaries, but this time was different. You walked away, not in hatred, not in bitterness, but with clarity. You saw them for who they were, and more importantly, you saw yourself for who you had become. Tired of performing, tired of bending, tired of living like your worth was a negotiation. So you stopped knocking on locked doors. You stopped trying to make broken people love you whole. You stopped asking people to meet you at a depth they had no intention of reaching. And to them, that wasn't healing. It was betrayal. Because when you no longer needed them to feel whole, they lost the script they used to control you. They mistook your silence for weakness, but in truth, it was your power finally speaking. You chose to let the storm pass through you without begging the storm to spare you. You sat with the pain. You faced the void. You cried in the privacy of your own company and didn't use the tears as currency for pity. You began rebuilding from the ashes they left behind, not to prove a point, but because you finally realized you didn't want to stay broken just so someone else could feel needed. You didn't post your healing journey for applause. You didn't decorate your scars with slogans. You simply lived, quietly, fully, and with every breath, you returned home to yourself, and that unnerved them. Because the one who used to break at their silence was now silent by choice. The one who once begged to be chosen had now chosen themselves. You weren't playing the game anymore. You weren't triggered by their coldness. You weren't entertained by their patterns, and that's what stung the most. Not that you moved on, but that you did so without spectacle, without making them the villain, without needing to be seen. You simply left, and in your leaving, you reclaimed something sacred, your peace. They wanted you broken and waiting. You chose to be whole and distant, and so they called you heartless. They painted you as cold, ungrateful, detached. But they never told the part of the story where you loved them through your own pain, where you forgave the things that were never acknowledged, where you held on far longer than you should have. No, they only told the ending, where you chose healing over begging, where you no longer gave them the role of savior in a story they helped shatter. And perhaps that's why they still speak of you with confusion, because you became something they never expected. You became free. You became what they couldn't control. They loved you when you were pliable, when you second-guessed yourself, when you asked for permission to speak, to feel, to exist, when you waited for their green light before taking a step. That's when they felt secure. That's when you were easy to handle, predictable, manageable, theirs. But then something shifted, slowly, almost invisibly at first. A boundary here, a pause there. The way you no longer laughed at what hurt you. The way your silence stopped being submissive and started becoming sacred. You weren't reacting anymore. You weren't defending, explaining, or dancing for approval. You were just still, and from that stillness they sensed danger. Not the danger that harms, but the kind that can no longer be owned. They didn't know how to handle it. You were no longer the same version of you they had memorized. You weren't the one who gave too many chances. You weren't the one who blurred lines in the name of love. You had become someone else, wiser, quieter, more intentional. You were no longer driven by fear of losing them. You were driven by the need to find yourself. And that self, the one they never fully respected, was finally emerging without apology. You became ungovernable, not because you were rebellious, but because you finally realized you were never meant to live under someone else's emotional rulebook. Control was never about love. It was about comfort. They found comfort in your chaos because it kept you reaching. They found power in your confusion because it kept you doubting. But now, your peace spoke louder than any argument. Your absence was heavier than your presence used to be. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't throw blame. You just reclaimed the pieces of yourself that had been scattered across years of people pleasing. And that made you unpredictable. They couldn't manipulate what they couldn't access anymore. They couldn't guilt trip someone who had already forgiven themselves. You stopped explaining your choices. You stopped attending conversations meant only to provoke you. You stopped rushing to fix things that were never yours to repair. And in doing so, you shattered the script. You became unresponsive to their tactics. The button they used to push no longer worked. The leash they once held no longer reached. You weren't playing the game. You had walked off the board completely. And now, they didn't know how to pull you back. They used to control you with fear of being alone, of being misunderstood, of being judged. But when you made peace with all of that, you stepped into a power they could never comprehend. So, they rewrote the narrative. They called you cold, selfish, distant, because in their world, detachment from control feels like betrayal. They tried to provoke reactions. They tested your silence, but you no longer owed them any response. Not out of hate, but out of growth. You weren't punishing them. You were protecting yourself. And for people used to having the final say in your identity, that was the deepest wound of all. They didn't lose you when you walked away. They lost you the moment you realized your soul wasn't a contract they could edit. They lost you when you started listening to the quiet voice within the one that kept whispering, "You don't belong in places that demand your silence." You didn't become dangerous. You became sovereign. And in a world addicted to power, nothing is more terrifying than someone who cannot be controlled. Not through fear, not through guilt, not through love. You didn't become their enemy. You simply became free, and that was the one thing they never prepared for. You held on to truth in a room full of masks. You saw through them, all of them. The forced smiles, the curated personas, the shallow praise wrapped around deeper envy. You watched people wear masks so often they forgot the shape of their own faces. They spoke in rehearsed lines, moved in predictable patterns, played roles they believed would keep them safe. But you never played along. You didn't perform, you didn't pretend. You walked into that room full of carefully constructed illusions and dared to speak truth. Your truth, calmly, clearly, without shame, and that made you dangerous. Not because you exposed them, but because your presence made exposure inevitable. They hated the way your honesty stripped away the comfort of their disguise. You weren't loud about it. You didn't call anyone out. You just refused to lie to belong. They couldn't stand how you stayed rooted in integrity while everyone else adjusted their truths to fit the crowd. You weren't the loudest. You weren't the most charming. But your authenticity disrupted their performance. Because when someone truly stands in who they are, they reflect who others are not. And nothing unsettles the pretender more than the presence of someone who doesn't need to pretend. You didn't flatter egos. You didn't exchange empty compliments for false acceptance. You simply spoke what was real, and in a room trained to applaud the politically correct and emotionally hollow, realness was seen as rebellion. They whispered about you. They said you were too serious, too intense, too blunt. But what they really meant was too honest, too unwilling to participate in emotional small talk, too unwilling to nod along when your soul said no. You didn't laugh when something wasn't funny. You didn't clap for performances that lacked sincerity. And because of that, they called you rigid, difficult, isolated. But they never understood the weight of wearing no mask in a room full of them. They never understood the courage it took to be real in a world where fake is the currency of connection. You weren't trying to be above anyone. You were just done with the performance. You were tired of pretending not to see the manipulation, the double standards, the quiet betrayals tucked behind polite smiles. You weren't angry. You were awake. You had simply outgrown the version of yourself that tolerated emotional games for the sake of temporary belonging. And so, they labeled you the problem, not because you disrupted peace, but because you disturbed the illusion. Your presence made them aware of everything they were avoiding in themselves. Your calmness was a confrontation. Your refusal to gossip, to judge, to join the echo chamber, that was your quiet rebellion, and they felt it. You didn't isolate yourself. They kept their distance because the mask doesn't feel safe next to someone who has nothing to hide. And maybe that's why your name lives in rooms you no longer enter, because you remind them of something they've buried, something raw, something real. You were the mirror they didn't want to look into, because in that reflection, they saw all the truth they had traded for comfort. You chose depth over popularity, truth over likability, soul over performance, and that made you rare, and rarely understood. But you weren't here to be understood by everyone. You were here to be true to yourself, and sometimes truth walks alone, but even alone, it is never without power. So let them call you distant, let them misunderstand your silence. You weren't made to blend in, you were made to hold light where others choose shadows. You weren't cold, you were clear, and in a world full of masks, clarity is mistaken for cruelty. But let them keep their stories. You'll keep your soul. You survived what was meant to destroy you, and smiled they watched you fall. Quietly, secretly, some of them even hoped you'd stay there, not out of hatred, but out of something colder, envy masked as indifference. They saw the weight on your shoulders, they saw the cracks forming, and deep down they expected those cracks to become your collapse. You were never meant to rise again, not in their script, but you did. Slowly, silently, without asking for applause, and when you returned, not broken but reborn, they didn't know how to respond, because people are comfortable with your wounds, not your healing. They understand your silence, not your strength. They were prepared for your downfall, but not your resurrection. And when you smiled, not a forced grin, but that soft, earned smile carved through pain, they felt it, deeply, and it unsettled them. They couldn't understand how you still had light in your eyes after everything, how you still spoke with kindness, how you walked with dignity after crawling through fire. They wanted to define you by the chapter where you were bleeding, but you kept writing, you kept turning pages. You didn't allow the pain to freeze your spirit. You didn't wear your scars like armor to harm, but like proof you had survived. And in that quiet resilience, you became unrecognizable to those who only knew you in pieces. You grew, and your growth made them uncomfortable, not because you changed, but because they didn't. They saw the fire, the betrayal, the heartbreak, whatever it was that should have shattered you, and they waited for it to consume you. But you learned how to breathe in the flames. You learned how to turn pain into fuel. You didn't just survive, you transformed. The version of you that emerged wasn't bitter, wasn't hardened. It was refined. You lost parts of yourself, yes. You mourned them. But in that mourning, something stronger took shape. Something quieter, deeper, more anchored. You no longer needed to prove your worth. You no longer needed to be heard by those committed to misunderstanding you. You were at peace, and that peace was deafening to those still at war with themselves. They didn't expect your smile to return, especially not after all the things they assumed would leave you hollow. But it did return, not because life became easier, but because you learned to carry joy and grief in the same breath. You smiled not because you forgot the pain, but because you survived it. And nothing terrifies the world more than a soul that smiles from a place of wholeness. It means you cannot be manipulated through your past. You cannot be guilted into silence. You cannot be reduced to what you once endured. You smiled, and in doing so, you reclaimed the narrative they tried to write for you. They'll say you changed. They'll say you became distant or strange or proud, but they won't say what really happened. That you found your way back to yourself, that you chose healing when bitterness was easier, that you chose peace when anger would have felt justified, that you smiled, not to prove anything, but because the storm lost its power over you. That smile was not weakness, it was closure, it was freedom. It was you returning to the world on your own terms, and that is what they never expected. They built a world where your fall made sense, but your rise didn't. They wrote you off before the story was over. But you kept writing anyway, quietly, powerfully, truthfully. You survived what was meant to destroy you, and smiled, and in that one act of defiance wrapped in grace, you became untouchable.